Welcome to the weekly report. It's February 4th and I'm Robert Barwick. Today we have three subjects to discuss. 1. US financial inquiry proves Gillard is a liar. 2. Australia's banks have a very deep begging bowl. And 3. Climate change guru Ross Garnaut, an economic hitman. Number 1. US financial inquiry proves Julia Gillard is a liar. On the 27th of January, America's Financial Crisis Inquiry Commission, chaired by Phil Angelides, which is otherwise known as the Angelides Commission, released its report, and its report was stunning. Its conclusion, to summarise, was that the global financial crisis was avoidable and unnecessary. On the website of the FCIC, which is worth looking up, www.fcic.gov, they quote the chairman of the commission, and his quote is uncharacteristically passionate for a government inquiry. It's not the normal kind of boring inquiry you're used to seeing. And on the front page of the website, it carries this quote: "The greatest tragedy would be to accept the refrain that no one could have seen this coming and thus nothing could have been done. If we accept this notion, it will happen again." End quote. So, this commission's findings totally destroys whatever credibility she may have had left, whatever credibility Julia Gillard may have had left. Now, why do I say that? Go and watch the CEC's production called the Homeowners and Bank Protection Bill, which is our history of the financial crisis in Australia. That production begins with the audio visual of Julia Gillard back in 2008 saying,
"No one 12 months ago was talking about a global financial crisis."
As the Deputy Prime Minister, Julia Gillard was the front man for the government to wheel out this line repeatedly. Nobody could have seen the financial crisis coming. Of course that wasn't true, because anyone who had heard of Lyndon LaRouche internationally or the CEC in Australia knew that a financial crisis was coming, because we had told them. We had told them since 1994. So everybody in the know knew that. Gillard's comment was for mass consumption, basically, so that the masses would stay oblivious to the fact that this was known to be coming, and therefore accept the government's line that they were responding after the fact on an emergency basis, and that's why there was all this confusion, etc., instead of doing what the CEC and LaRouche said should have been done as a solution. But now it's not just LaRouche and the CEC saying that. It is the United States government's top inquiry into the subject. This Angelides Commission was set up in May 2009 to look into this. They have examined it thoroughly, and they have made this very important statement. More importantly than the statement they've made that it was avoidable and unnecessary, is Phil Angelides and his commission blamed the cause of the crisis on exactly what LaRouche said it was, which was the destruction of the Glass-Steagall Act, which is what opened up the US financial system and by extension the world to this total flood of speculative frenzy, gambling debts, which is now drowning the world. So this is quite key. Now it puts the onus on governments, not just the United States government, but all governments around the world, including Australia's governments. How do they respond to this? This has pulled the rug out from under them and shown them to be liars if they stick with Gillard's line. So the question is, how do they respond to this? And it's given them only one possible path, which is exactly what LaRouche has been calling for: a global Glass-Steagall. Take the gambling debts and scrap them, scrap the financial institutions that go with those gambling debts, only protect the financial activities of the real economy through regulations, etc., and create a national banking system that can then put new credit into the economy to finance real economic growth through infrastructure, manufacturing, etc. So this is quite an important turning point in this fight over how the world will respond to the global financial crisis. Number 2, Aussie banks have a very deep begging bowl. So connected to what I've just discussed is the state of Australia's financial system, which we remember other country that the world has been told has survived the financial crisis the best. We are the example to the world of pristine economic conditions, great financial management, etc. We're the envy of the world supposedly, except if you live here, of course, and you have to experience the cost of living crisis and all those things that we're copying at the moment. But remember last year in this forum, I discussed quite a lot this sort of belated discovery that Joe Hockey made of what we had been saying for a long time about all of a sudden what alarmed him was how much money our banks owed overseas and were therefore dependent upon other sources of borrowing overseas in order to roll over their existing loans. And Hockey said at the end of last year that this year our banks would be borrowing even more money from overseas to roll over their existing loans, but this year would be harder because a lot of governments around the world are going to the same borrowing sources, and our banks will find it much more difficult. Well, figures are emerging now what that means for Australia. Australia's big 4 banks this year are going to need to borrow in the order of $135 billion in wholesale funding from overseas. $135 billion. Interestingly, it's slightly lower than what they had to borrow last year. Last year, between them, they borrowed something like $150 billion. The Commonwealth Bank borrowed $54 billion last year, Westpac $43 billion, National Australia Bank $28 billion, ANZ $26 billion. So that adds up to about $150 billion. This year, they've got to borrow something like $135 billion. Where is the money going to come from? The Deputy CEO of the ANZ Bank, whose name is Graham Hodges, said in the Financial Review on the 1st of February, he said the game had changed from the days before the financial crisis when banks could always find more cheap money to meet credit growth. Quote, banks need to be better managers of their balance sheets in an environment where liquidity and funding are a key constraint, he said. So this is the big question hanging over the banks in Australia. In fact, it's the sword of Damocles hanging over their heads. And here's the most telling point about our banks in this regard. According to a study by UBS, the Swiss bank, as a proportion of their total assets, each of Australia's big 4 banks are in the list of the world's most heavily reliant banks on wholesale borrowings. In other words, they're more heavily reliant on borrowings to fund the loans that they issue than their own deposits, which is a terrible vulnerability to have if you are a bank. That's what the UBS report highlights. All of our big 4 banks are in that position, led by the Commonwealth Bank. So that's the sword of Damocles hanging over their head this year. Stay tuned for more updates on that. And finally, I just want to talk about climate change guru Ross Garnaut as an economic hitman. First of all, Ross Garnaut is once again in the public limelight. He's having another crack at climate change and the necessity to put a quote-unquote price on carbon. Remember, it was the Garnaut report that was the basis of Kevin Rudd's ETS proposal in 2008, 2009. Garnaut is at the beginning of a process, so he's going to release 8 reports this year. Apparently they decided that 2 years ago when he released his report, it was something like over 600 pages. No one could read it. So they're going to have another crack at it by breaking up into 8 different reports. So he's started releasing the first one now. The CEC, led by Queensland State Secretary Jan Picallis and a contingent of the LaRouche Youth Movement, intervened on him last night, February 3rd, at Melbourne's Federation Square for his first meeting. Jan Picallis posed him a question, and the gist of the question was, why aren't you recommending something like nuclear power as a solution if you're so worried about climate change. Because of course, anyone who knows, if you want to supposedly reduce carbon emissions, and the biggest source of carbon emissions is energy production, and you want to keep energy production, though, you have to switch to something like nuclear, which is emissions free. That's just standard. We're not saying we need to reduce carbon emissions, but anyone knows that's the case. But of course, what they're proposing, or what Garnaut's proposing, is all renewable energy, etc., which will decrease your energy production. And if you don't have enough energy in a growing population, you're going to kill people. Anyway, so that was the gist of Jan's question. Garnaut couldn't answer her question. He stumbled over it, blah, 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 blah. Why? Because look at Garnaut's track record. He is what you call an economic hitman. There's a great book by John Perkins on this subject in relation to the US and the Bush administration that came out around 2001, Confessions of an Economic Hitman, that gives you a bit of a gist of how these economic hitmen operate. I'm just going to give some basic background now to Ross Garnaut, just to give you a flavour of it. We will publish more of this in press releases in the very near future. But here's Ross Garnaut. He's an economist. He's one of the developers in Australia of what we call economic rationalism. He first got an important job when he was seconded to the government of Papua New Guinea in the period just before and just after Papua New Guinea independence in 1975. His job there was to structure PNG's post-independence economy, and he structured it on the footing of a resources-based economy. In other words, an economy that multinational companies could loot for its resources. Garnaut structured it that way. He followed that up with a very important role in the Hawke-Keating administration. He was Prime Minister Bob Hawke's principal economic advisor in the first few years of his administration, 83 to 85, before he became ambassador to China. And then he followed that up in 89. He produced a report for the government, Australia and the Northeast Asian Ascendancy, which became the foundation of Australia's total opening up to free trade, which destroyed our manufacturing. So this was Ross Garnaut, key in these government initiatives. Following 89, he then switched roles a bit to cash in on all these things he proposed. He got a job overseeing directly privatisations in Australia of Bank West, the Western Australian State Bank, and its subsidiary, the Primary Industries Bank of Australia. His job was to structure those banks to prepare them for privatisation, for which, of course, as chairman, he was handsomely rewarded. He got very well paid jobs in Papua New Guinea, cashing in on the resource boom in Papua New Guinea, which he helped set Papua New Guinea up for as the chairman of Rio Tinto's Lihir Gold and BHP's Octedi subsidiary, which was made a mess by BHP. He also oversaw privatisations in Papua New Guinea in the late 1990s, early 2000 period. So this is the hallmark of what you call an economic hitman. Therefore, when Ross Garnaut has been wheeled out now, suppose there's a guru of climate change, this is why. It's got nothing to do with any expertise he has on climate change. This man has the experience to know exactly how he's like a heat-seeking missile when it comes to destroying nations. He has the experience for it. He has quite a special relationship with Kevin Rudd going way back. That's obviously why it was one of the reasons he was called on in the first place. And that's why he's the key guy to oversee, if they can get it up, this implementation of a carbon price which will drive our economy back into the dark ages, which is already halfway there now, thanks to what he's done on free trade, etc. We've defeated it before in 2009, and we will smash it again if you work with us. So stay tuned for more developments on that as well. You'll see it in press releases on our website.